And hello, everybody. My name is Michael Farnham, CTO with Set Solutions. Hope you are doing well. I am joined by Ted Gutierrez over at SecurityGate, CEO at SecurityGate. Today, we are going to be talking about security assessments, how to make them effective, what kind of assessments there are out there. Maybe you've got some ideas of what kind of security assessments there are. And I think Ted is here to help kind of educate a little bit. Maybe there's some you haven't thought of. So Ted, wanted to say hello and thank you to you for joining. And if you want, just give a kind of quick rundown of SecurityGate and yourself, if you would.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks for having me on the show. My name is Ted, CEO at SecurityGate. We are in the business of ensuring that cybersecurity improves, right? So for asset owners or consultants that you use to improve your overall cybersecurity program, we're in the business of helping companies figure that out. And part of that is assessments. Part of it is project planning and remediations on those assessments. And I'm excited to talk today about what we see in the industry as ways that people can do them better. My background, I came from Shell, actually was doing third-party risk assessments for a lot of the engineers on the upstream and the downstream side. My tool of choice was Excel. And after a couple of years of almost 200 different audits and assessments globally, I realized there had to be a better way to make sure that a given company can improve, has the tools to improve. So it's my pleasure to be here today. Look forward to a great collaboration about just the word assessments and what they can do well for different practitioners and asset owners out there.
Well, I appreciate that intro, Ted. Yeah, I think a lot of practitioners out there are quite familiar with Excel, know how to create some monster pivot tables and do some really cool stuff with Excel, but it definitely has its limitations. So having somebody who's built this is part of the reason why we wanted you on, because you've done this before and you've done it as a practitioner. That's not always the case for tech CEOs out there. So it's good to have your experience. Appreciate you joining us on this. For everybody who doesn't know, SecurityGate's actually a fairly new partner of ours, but we're really excited about what they do in the cybersecurity space, and specifically some OT space as well. Very, very strong background. So glad to have you here. So Ted, let's just jump into this. Like I've said before, we're going to be talking about security assessments. I think what's interesting is that as I've talked to practitioners over the years, and as I've been a practitioner, I think what a lot of folks tend to think is that a security assessment is a traditional gap assessment, and they don't really think about the other ones. I've talked before about having broader assessments and very narrow assessments and everything in between. But there really are other types of assessments other than gap assessments, security gap assessments. So when I say security gap assessments, I mean going up against some kind of framework. So can you talk to that? Maybe starting out, what a traditional gap assessment looks like, what that goes up against, and then what other kind of assessments at a high level are there in your mind?
Yeah, and I think it's important, Michael, that we, syntax or terminology matters. So like some people use the word assessment to describe an event or a series of events where there is a known standard and you assess or you evaluate or compare against that known standard. I think that's where most people talk about the gap assessment. Mm-hmm. But other people call it different things, right? Some people call it diagnostics. Some people call it health checks. What we want to make sure that we do is classify them away from like a vulnerability assessment or a pen test. Mm-hmm. And what we ought to classify in kind of as a foundation is that one of the first things that people think of when they think of assessments should incorporate people, process, as well as tech, right? I actually have a couple slides. Can I share my screen and show them?
Absolutely, please do.
So let's see if we can do this right here. So let me share my screen, that way we can. Is that showing up well? That'll allow me to kind of move through the slides really effectively.
Just popped up. Yep, got it.
Okay, perfect. So I think when you think about the word assessment, that's what's used in 95% of the different organizations out there. So that's what the word that we use, but it doesn't mean that you can't do a diagnostics or a health check at the same time. And I think that everybody's got a lot of access to tooling. They've got a lot of access to new resources, but why would your maturity of your overall organization be holding you back? And this is where assessments can get really helpful. If you level set on people, process, and tech, what's happening right now, I see across multiple sector types, is you got more non-technical, non-security people influencing cyber. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think you'd probably argue the same, that more heads are getting into cybersecurity, is becoming more visible. And as a result, scrutiny from the board of directors, guidance from different government agencies, sector groups, there's a lot more resources out there. And from a tech perspective, a lot of people are using Guardian solutions with this set it and forget it mentality. So right out of the gate, one of the things that I think we should address is, do people think assessments are valuable? And if they do, why? And if they don't, why? Right? I'm not sure what your perspective is, Michael, but I think all three of these parts of a great security program are at an all-time high. You got more people involved, you got more processes to follow, and you got more tech, right? And so where do you see assessments kind of fitting in? Like, is it something you slow down allocation of resources on the other three areas for? What's been your perspective on assessments in general?
So what I've tried to preach is that if you want to get into cybersecurity, let's say it that way, and you are not technical, to your point here,
right,
but you want to break into cybersecurity, the GRC area at all, but just the assessment, the risk assessments, those type of
right,
assessments, auditing, those kind of things can help you understand this area of cybersecurity extremely well at a very high level, and can help you get an entry point into it. And what we've seen are people coming in from that direction in order to learn cybersecurity and not have that technical mindset necessarily. And I think it's been strong because they can supply various viewpoints. I've got a customer right now that has a degree in music, and he entered cybersecurity, wanted to enter cybersecurity, and he's done it from the assessment side and more of the process side and the people side versus the tech side. And he's been extremely effective in bringing different viewpoints. And I've seen that with our customers, that can offer a lot of benefits versus just the technical side, which, being a CTO, I'm used to, and that's what I enjoy, is the technology. But you're absolutely 100%. If you have the mindset of, this tech is going to solve my problem, and you don't put in the people in the process to figure out what it's doing and how effective it is, then you are definitely going to fail.
Yeah. And I think another thing, so you're saying assessments can be used as a way to bring non-technical, non-security folks into the fold of cyber, really get them to be value add personnel. I totally agree. Another way of almost saying the same thing is, you've got highly technical people that have been in cyber for a really long time. How do they translate current state security, current state risk, current state compliance maybe to these non-technical people? I think that's the number one place we see globally in the market overall increases in demand for cyber assessments are because the non-technical folks, they know that the controls are in place because they're implementing technology. That's their day-to-day job, but they don't always have a really great way to showcase that in a non-technical language. So I think that's another reason. The challenge comes is it gets really challenging when you got so many options, right? So I like this slide. We used it recently in a big presentation we did, because you can see some things in there, like, you can see CISA, you see NIST, you see IEC, you see maturity, and it gets really hard to see through those trees. And I think one of the biggest problems, not a problem, but a challenge that we have in the industry right now, is that we've got an aging workforce that has been real risk management practitioners that for a very, very long time have been able to either manage security at a corporate level, but only maybe an inch or two deep, or we've had them in siloed capacities where they're doing a lot of security in say this facility, or say in this business unit, right? And now what's starting to happen now is, because of all these new people and these new processes, is that the entire company as a whole there's a demand on that company, a demand on those practitioners to showcase risk management on a much larger scale than they haven't had to do in the past. And so where that starts to bring in some challenges, it brings in different syntax, it brings in different goals. You may have chief financial officers saying, hey, look, what's the ROI on our budgets? You may have operational people saying, hey, what's the recovery time objective that if this facility goes down, this is how much time we're going to have to get it back up and running. You've got compliance, maturity. This is the world that a lot of practitioners live in right now. And so you asked a question about 4 minutes ago, which was, hey, what type of assessments are there out there? It's important to kind of break it down and understand there's more than a few types of assessments. And they're all based on the allocation of resources that you have, right? If you've got a really low budget, not a lot of tons of skill on the team, and you're just trying to get an overarching understanding of where a couple scenarios could really impact the business, that's where business impact analysis comes in. Some people call these BIAs, right? They are non-technical, they're non-technical in nature, they're pretty easy to run. And they really bring the whole team together, the ops people, the finance people, the leadership. They bring them together and say, man, if we were hit with ransomware or we were hit with some sort of cyber attack, which of our facilities are the ones that are going to be impacted the most, right? A lot of people are starting to do these more and more, some by bringing finance into the discussion, some just trying to level set on all of the spend that they've made on their cybersecurity. They just say, okay, so what's the impact now comparatively to 12 to 24 months ago?
So would you liken that to also, some people would call that probably like a tabletop exercise to actually go through a scenario? Is that part of that, or is that?
Yeah, so one outcome of the business impact analysis, you can do business impact analysis for one site, but when they start really becoming more valuable is when you do BIAs for a bunch of different sites. And then you compare. Why don't we go to another slide and I'll show you some of the data points on them. What you're doing through a BIA, one of the outcomes very well may be an incident response exercise to actually test the systematic approach to getting your business back up and running safely. That could be a very important part of the output of a BIA. What I see a lot of people do is either their leadership or for insurance purposes, they've said, we need to do an incident response exercise. Great. It's absolutely important. But if you had not run a business impact analysis holistically across the company, how do you know you're doing your incident response exercise in the right places, or if you have the right people on the team? That's my perspective. So what you're looking for in a BIA is how important are all these different functions of the company or these different business units that fit together, and how is it interrelated, right? And so where I see the most healthy thing that a company can do, low time, low personnel, low budget, is to bring operations and security people together in one room and go through a business impact analysis where you're going to start saying, okay, if that particular facility went down, how much would it take to get it back up? So you're talking about non-financial and financial impacts and resources to a given scenario like ransomware or a system disruption in your third party or an outage. You're walking through the scenario and say, okay, that just happened. What are we doing now? And it's not so much the incident responses as what are the items that we're going to be doing to bring it back up online. You're looking at what is the impact to the overall business if that chemical facility gets shut down versus those chemical facilities. And what I strive, the goal for me and any organization I'm working with is do it holistically. Think really, really big when you do your BIAs. And the output is, a lot of people like the red, yellow, green. A lot of people like a list, kind of a table function where you have different scores. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at each other, ops people, security people, leadership people, and you're all looking at each other and saying, okay, we sort of have rank ordered our facilities. That's on the impact of one of them going down. Now I think you're in a really great foundational place where you can start developing your cybersecurity program. Because what happens with a lot of vendors sometimes is that we'll come out, we'll say, well, you need this technical tool everywhere. Well, maybe, but maybe they don't, the company didn't have the resources for that, right? So how do you allocate your resources effectively when you don't have as many as you wish you had.
Well, I think it does allow you to rank. It also, I love the fact that you've got impact in there where it increases that company-wide understanding, because that, if you do have an organization that has little to no resources allocated to cybersecurity, but you're able to get the buy-off from the executives to say, let's do this BIA and let's start
Right.
getting these people together and showing them that this is an important thing, then that is where your next level of maturity starts popping up, because you've got everybody understanding this. Now you can start actually figuring out where some of your problems are in the cybersecurity world.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Here's a slide that I like to use. This is our terminology. I think a lot of people, you could look at all the different frameworks that are out there. We'll go over gap assessments shortly. When I look at the industry, I categorize companies, asset owners, into 4 categories. They're either on the far left-hand side of the maturity spectrum, where they're just preparing that journey. There's about 10 or 12 things you've got to do really well in the prepare phase that enables you to mature long-term. One of them is producing a budget. The second is developing a scope. The third is developing a framework that you're going to map to. A lot of people want to just go and buy the top technology so they can sleep at night. And I feel you. Everybody is concerned about cybersecurity, but if you move all the way to the far right hand of the spectrum, where you're implementing very, very complex security solutions and you don't have the right fundamentals in place, what'll probably happen is you're either not going to take advantage of that full security solution suite.
Mm-hmm.
You are going to get pinched by your leadership on budget the following year with the end of the contract, because you weren't able to showcase some sort of maturity as a whole. And so, like I always stress to people, it's okay to be in the prepare phase. Once you move into what we call the baseline phase, you're probably using a framework-based assessments to map against a known systematic approach to controls, right? You're about to say, okay, out of these X amount of controls, we have 50% of them in place. We need to put a plan in place to do another 50. When you move into the accelerate phase, this is when, usually at the 2 to 3 year mark, you've conducted these gap assessments quite regularly. BIAs have been a function of your overall business model. And then you want to accelerate it with technology, whether that's ticketing solutions, whether that's some sort of mapping solution. And then eventually you move into incorporate. And where I thought it was important to kind of map what we're talking about today is, if you're not doing business impact analysis to drive a priority, Michael, in the early stages of your cyber maturity, chances are you're going to overspend on resources. You're going to overwork your people. You're going to get your project roadmap way too full, and you're not going to have enough time to implement solutions. Or you're just going to spend a ton of money on technology when you really haven't gotten the fundamentals of your people and process done. So I encourage people that are in the early stages of their cyber journey to do the BIAs, drive that priority, which then brings out the gap assessment.
Absolutely. I remember when I first got into a pre-sales engineering role, I had a customer say that they were just starting out a new company, brand new company. They were splitting off of something else, but they had to build all new infrastructure. They proceeded to go to my salesperson that I was working with and tell them they needed all these different technical components. And luckily I had a very mature security person or salesperson, and she was in line with me. And we said, look, you do not need to go buy all of this stuff yet. You need to figure out what your business is going to be, where you're going to have the problems, essentially talking about a business impact analysis, and then start defining where your gaps are. And then you can start incorporating on all these things and put all these things in. Ended up creating an extremely loyal customer, because we could have made a lot of money selling them a lot of tech and having them implement it and be completely lost once it was all in. It really didn't make any sense. So if you come at it from that perspective and you're not just trying to put a lot of tech in, then I think that's strong. That gives you that ability to focus it and make sure it's effective for your organization. One of the issues, though, I see is that when you go from BIA, it's not an issue, it's just a problem to solve, is how do you start determining, when you do go to the gap assessment, what framework you're going to use? Is that a business decision as well, or is that more of a I need to go with what's the most popular? I mean, how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, I think, where is it? The slide that you can't see the forest for the trees, right?
Mm,
How do you want to choose, your a given set of controls, right? So I think you have to ask yourself, NIST is in our world over 55% of practitioners out there are using NIST and NIST CSF primarily right now. There's 853, 882. You got some different variations of what level of maturity you're going to be at. You can also, it's a pretty dynamic capability that you have when you run with NIST. You can run an implementation goal, and then you can map yourself to that implementation number. If you're traditionally an IT-based organization and you don't have any plans of any operational technology or operations in general, I think ISO is a really great place to start.
mm,
As you move into more the heavy industry where you really have process control networks, DCS environments, SCADA environments, that's where I really encourage people to look at IC 62443 and all the different variations and subsets of that. Maritime in BIMCO, you've got folks in the defense place that are going to have to deal with DFARS. Bottom line, I think that if you are one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors deemed critical by CISA, there's a ton of resources out there to choose. What I would tell you, Michael, is that I see some people that have that failure to launch. They don't know how to choose a gap assessment framework, and then they just get stuck.
Yep.
And what I will tell you is that roughly 250 controls exist out there. 250 controls, and some of those, there are like access control or hardware inventory. There's a lot of different variations from framework or standard to standard that absolutely say the same thing. So if you really distill it down, there's less than 200 controls out there. So it is less important which framework you choose. It is more important that you really have a long-term plan on how you're going to implement that framework. Here's an example. I was working with a customer the other day that said, look, we don't run assessments that often because we know exactly what cyber controls we're going to go and fix this quarter and next quarter and next quarter. And I told him, I said, well, then why aren't you running assessments on just those control domains? Mm-hmm. So when you look at, maybe 64 different control types, if you have the maturity and the resources to do so, it doesn't matter what framework you use. It's more important to say, okay, these are the different control domains that we're going to go after in this pay period or this time period, and then map accordingly to that. So we've invested heavily in a lot of configurability on our end and what we offer the market. And the reason is because we don't believe that a given framework is better than the next. What is most important is that you choose one that meets your controls needs, right? And what you're doing is you're essentially diagnosing yourself, your organization, whatever scope you determine against that known set of controls. And I think NIST does this really well because it, just like others, C2, M2 does it really well. A lot of is they'll categorize your different domains and functions so that you can understand kind of what areas you're protecting against, right? But what you're really trying to do when you run what the 95% of the market considers an assessment is you're trying to understand control gaps. Do I have that in place because it's recommended? I don't have that in place. Okay. What I think a lot of people don't do well is they don't approach the assessment with the end state in mind. Most people will approach an assessment saying, here's our assessment date, here's how many resources we're going to put behind it, and what are they actually aiming at? They're aiming at a list of controls that they're missing, and they think that's the finish line. But in reality, that's like turn one. Turn two is saying, okay, here are all the controls that we have, and here are the known resources I have this budget cycle to deploy. Turn three is prioritizing all those remediations, and then turn four in that race is really saying, okay, these are the remediations that I'm going to get approved by my management, and now I'm going to go downstream and put in place. That is something that it can happen monthly, it can happen annually, it can happen quarterly. What I encourage the market to think about is if you're doing assessments, great, but if you're doing them in a way that the end state is just the report, I would say you're probably setting yourself up for failure. What you're really wanting to do with your assessment is bring all those operational, finance, leadership people together on one pane of glass, if you will. And you want to bring them under one standard, one language and syntax. So that when you start talking about encryption, you start talking about asset inventory, you start talking about incident response exercises, these people that are non-technical don't need to know exactly what that means, but they do need to understand, is encryption going to be something that I'm working on given where I fit in the business model? Is incident response going to be something that I'm a part of as I fit in the business model? And so that's where we see that connection of the BIA and the gap assessment, really the output of the gap assessment being the real synergy that I think the market really deserves to experience.
So you've done your BIA, you've started doing your analysis of where you need to focus, what's the most important to put controls in place, whatever those may be. Now you're figuring out what controls you're missing with the gap assessment. It's giving you some, like you said, a common framework for everybody to work from, which is extremely important. If you're all over the place, it's not going to be effective. So now you've started that cycle that you were talking about, those different steps, and you use, and I know you know this, but you use the term finish line. There's never is a finish line for this. It's continuous improvement.
Should be.
But now what's next? Now that you've done this and you've got a framework built and you're actually doing this constant assessment, what comes next after that? Yeah, you've got the incorporate. So what do you consider? I've got in my mind what I think a component assessment is, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Yeah, so so if we look at the gap assessment functionality, like as a step, if you will, yes, it's continual improvement. I just want to mention real quick, the overall gap assessment, there could be 20 of these for your business. There could be 100 of these over a 2-year period. And I think if you look at it as, let's say, number 2, the gap assessment is number 2, assessing it is 2A, prioritizing is 2B, and then 2C is your remediation. That drives an immense amount of project planning, right? One of the things that will come out from that project planning is incorporating patches or buying new hardware at the component level. And so where we see many of the most mature companies in this industry, we see less than 10% right now at this level, is they've been doing gap assessments for a really long time. BIAs are part of their go-to-market plan. Now they're trying to figure out, where do I prioritize assessing components within my overall architecture? Could be on IT architecture, could be on OT architecture. And how do I make sure that the architecture that I'm building or the new equipment that I'm putting in place or refreshing, how do I layer over some threats, and how do I lay over some risks on those threats and the probability? And this is where there's a lot of very, very unique methodologies in the market. You see some assessment frameworks out there that will help you select a given piece of hardware. You can run threat scenarios on that. You're able to really map out what are the various ways that I can assess and model what's the worst thing that can happen, where's it going to happen, who's it going to affect, and it really requires a lot of different people to do that. This is also where you're going to be bringing in some element of threat feed, some element of vulnerability feed, some element of asset hardening or asset inventory feeds to give you another display of data to help map all of your components. There's some customers out there that have 4,000 or 5,000 components on a global scale. There's some organizations that have hundreds. When you reach a level of maturity that you have the majority of your controls in place strategically at the people, process, and tech layer, now you're going to go a level deeper and you say, okay, now I'm playing the what if game. What if this particular vulnerability is harnessed by a threat actor? What would the impact be to that zone or to that facility or sub-facility? And so we see it as a really, I don't want to use the word expensive, but I think it is a high resource allocation function. But we see it happening more and more and more as we have more data that's coming in on the actual solutions or on the components themselves.
And I think this is an area where a lot of additional tech is being developed that can be brought in to do that continuous assessment as well. It's a really interesting area that I've seen as well, with different tools being able to feed in the status of, to your point, of the effectiveness of the other tools that you've got in So it's a really good connection point between tech and assessments.
To me, to me, it's very much, if you're at a state where you mentioned somebody that was with music, I would say that, the business impact analysis is like getting a 3-piece band together, right? And then the next folks, this is when you start bringing in some vocals, right? You start getting more people. Maybe you get a bass, a baritone, a soprano, and an alto. Now you're making music, right? When you get over here is when you're at the orchestration level. You're really bringing everybody together to harmonize, and you're looking at all the different controls that you have in place, and you're playing the what if scenario game. And I think one of the biggest challenges, going back to this slide, which I think is what we could end on, is I think a lot of practitioners are falling into a trap of trying to incorporate before they ever prepare baseline or accelerate. And what happens is, we start to see this right now, you see some really, really expensive solutions out there that are churning their subscriptions or churning their customers. And the reason is because people in the non-technical roles that actually are signing the budgets are saying, man, we've had this crazy threat intel, this vulnerability assessment solution, all of this mappings, the deep dark web guarding solutions, and yet we're still under attack, right? And that I'm not saying that that's good or bad. I'm just saying that I think the majority of the industry deserves to have a little bit more of a hardened playbook. And I encourage folks to think about business impact analysis and gap assessments to lay the foundation for effective usage of some of those guardian solutions.
I think that's a fantastic spot to end it, Ted. That was a great ending line, and I think you're absolutely correct. Let's do it in the right order, get everybody involved and everybody invested before you just start throwing a bunch of tech against the wall. So, well, any parting words, sir?
No, I appreciate being on the show. Appreciate everything you guys do at Set Solutions, and we're super excited to be partnered with you. There's so many folks out there that I think are looking for ways to improve, and we're excited to be a helping hand.
Same here. We really enjoy the partnership. Everybody, do yourself a favor, check out SecurityGate. Great stuff. Great partner at Set Solutions. We partner at a bunch of different levels with them to help do assessments. So I'm excited about that. Thanks everybody for being on. Ted, once again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the next webinar.
Cheers.